In this video, we demonstrate how active gap fillers can be modified in the field to correct uneven gaps on a fire-rated wood door and accommodate existing hardware, restoring the opening to compliance. Field conditions vary. Installers often encounter tapered gaps or irregular clearances that require adjustment. Active gap fillers are designed for field modification in accordance with NFPA 80, allowing excessive perimeter gaps to be corrected while maintaining the fire-rated assembly. The top of the door has a taper gap that is wider on the left and tighter to the right. The hinge side also has a wider gap on top that tapers down. Before installation, it is important to understand how these gaps develop. Over time, real-world conditions can shift a fire door within its frame. Common causes include door sagging, building movement or settling, improper frame installation, incorrect door or frame measurements, and flooring changes after installation. When the door position changes, clearances change. We see gaps become visible and may vary across the perimeter. These uneven gaps require solutions that can adapt to fit their specific compliance needs. Active gap fillers allow these conditions to be corrected directly through field modification, unique for each frame. Although we're focusing on these specific gaps today, it's important to note that the same measuring and modification methods can be applied to gap fillers throughout the entire perimeter. First, we need to measure the existing clearance. Using the active gap gauge, measure along the head of the door. The maximum allowable clearance for wooden fire doors is 1/8 inch. If the gauge inserts at the compliance mark, the opening exceeds the limit. Starting on the left, the gauge inserts at the compliance mark, proving non-compliance. On the right, the gap narrows but remains excessive across the full head of the door. Insert the sample set together with the gap gauge to determine the correct filler size needed. When the sample size fits and the gap gauge can no longer be inserted with it, the correct thickness has been identified. On this opening, 1/8 inch width size is required for most of the head, with 1/16 inch needed on the right. This difference in size confirms the gap must be corrected with modification. There are two acceptable approaches. One option is to use 2 gap fillers of the appropriate thicknesses needed, measure the exact lengths, depending on the taper, cut each one, and install them so they meet at the transition point. The second option is to use a single 1/8 inch gap filler. Measure and mark where the gap starts to taper. Then sand down the section needed to match the taper. Both methods are compliant. In this installation, we will continue with the sanding method. To find exactly where the taper starts on your door, insert the 1/8 inch sample along the head until it no longer moves smoothly. At that exact point, where we see friction, is where the gap transitions. Next, we need to measure and mark the location of the taper point and transfer it to our gap filler. When moving on to sand the gap filler, ensure you sand the backside, or where there is no label, to avoid any tampering and to keep aesthetics nice and neat. Sand the gap filler gradually. Field modification does not interrupt the Intertek fire-rated listing. The label must remain intact and visible after installation. After sanding, test fit the gap filler to confirm it installs smoothly and allows proper door operation. Do this by inserting it into the door head, looking for no friction or resistance when inserting. If friction occurs, continue to sand gradually until you have an easy fit. An increasingly more common piece of hardware we see today are door position switches. If a door position switch is present, gap fillers can be modified to fit around them. First, measure its diameter and the distance from the frame edge. Transfer those measurements to the back of the gap filler and drill using a step bit. Drill from the back side to maintain a clean, finished appearance. Before installation, pre-drill mounting holes using a 1/8 inch drill bit. Then install the gap filler evenly so it sits flush within the frame. The tapered head gap has now been corrected using field-modified active gap fillers. Lastly, we must recheck the clearance using the active gap gauge. When the gauge is no longer able to insert at the 1/8 compliance mark for wooden doors, we know compliance has been restored. Now let's move on to address the excessive clearances on the hinge side of the door. We will measure above and below each hinge. we see an excessive gap at the 1/8 inch compliance mark. Using the sample set, we can determine the correct size compliance solution is a 1/8 inch gap filler. Now we measure the exact length needed. Then we transfer it to our gap filler and mark it before cutting. After cutting, we need to test to ensure it is the correct fit. Insert the section into the door, ensuring it inserts easily without friction. Next, we measure below the first hinge, confirming non-compliance. Sizing with the sample set shows that this section contains a tapered gap. A 1/8 inch gap filler is required at the upper portion of this section, transitioning to 1/16 inch gap filler as the gap narrows. Now let's find the exact point where the gap taper begins on your door. It should be exactly where you start to feel resistance and friction. Then we will note the length and transfer it to our gap filler before we start sanding. After transferring the measurement, use the taper transition mark as your starting point. Sand the backside of the gap filler to maintain aesthetic appearance and avoid label tampering. Continue sanding until it reduces to 1/16 of an inch where necessary. Now let's test fit the gap filler to confirm it inserts smoothly, without friction, and allows proper door operation. If necessary, you can drill a new fastener hole into the gap fillers using a 1/8 inch drill bit and countersink it for a flush finish. Remember to pre-drill the mounting holes. Line up your gap fillers and mark where the predetermined holes are located and transfer to the frame. Install the gap filler segments evenly so they sit flush within the frame. Gap fillers are designed specifically for adjustment in accordance with NFPA 80 and provide practical solutions for correcting excessive clearances while maintaining the fire-rated assembly. Once you are finished installing, we will need to recheck the clearances with the gap gauge to ensure compliance is met after installation. When the gauge can no longer insert at the compliance mark of 1/8 inch, we have successfully mitigated our fire door for excessive clearances, adjusting for door hardware and taper gaps. Active gap fillers are Intertek tested, approved, and certified up to and including 90 minutes.